Imagine being a British Parachute Regiment officer in the early 1970s. You sit down to write a report for your superiors, explaining how your elite, highly trained soldiers faced a local IRA gunman in the streets of Ballymurphy, who had made himself so dangerous that the British Army required an intelligence-led, covert ambush just to remove him. Now imagine that the man in question had already escaped from British custody at least twice. That the New York Times covered his second escape on the day it happened, calling him an IRA leader who had seized a gun from a prison officer and walked out through an underground tunnel in a stolen uniform. That British military intelligence had named him personally as one of the most dangerous individuals in Northern Ireland. That the IRA's own inner circle was, by some accounts, frightened of him. That intelligence file existed. The unit that killed him compiled a detailed account of the operation. Their assessment: he was among the most wanted and dangerous men in Northern Ireland. An IRA colleague who had known Bryson for years offered a different characterization entirely. That Bryson was a man whose capacity for violence made even his own side uneasy. Both descriptions were applied to the same 25-year-old man from the same housing estate. The British officer's language was clinical, professional, the precise vocabulary of someone writing into an official record. The IRA man's language was personal and unguarded. Neither softened the assessment, neither qualified it. On the fundamental point that James Bryson was someone whose capacity for violence operated on a different register from almost everyone around him, the British Army and the Provisional IRA were in complete agreement. James Bryson, known in Ballymurphy as Jim or Jimmy, was born into the estate where he would spend his entire operational life, sometime around 1947 or 1948. He held the rank of Officer Commanding B Company, 2nd Battalion, Provisional IRA, a fact recorded not in Republican commemorations but in a British Army war diary. He was described by McGill magazine as a feared sniper who used an Armalite rifle fitted with a telescopic sight. The mural that Ballymurphy painted for him after his death shows him carrying a Lewis gun, a weapon associated with the moment his community chose to remember him most clearly. Not as an organizational asset, but as a man who walked into the streets and acted. He is largely absent from the mainstream political history of the Troubles. He doesn't appear in the peace process narrative. He isn't the figure anyone points to when explaining how the conflict ended. What he is, and what the documented record confirms, is something rarer and in some ways more instructive. A single local operator who made himself so dangerous that the British Army required an intelligence-led, covert ambush just to remove him. A gunman who forced elite soldiers to think about the geography of one housing estate as if it were enemy territory, with a known, specific, individual threat embedded in its walls. This is his story, and the story of what it cost to be posted to Ballymurphy when Bryson was still alive. Ballymurphy sits at the foot of the Belfast Hills, pressed between the Springfield Road to its east and the rising ground of the Black Mountain to the northwest. It was built as post-war public housing in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Long rows of terraced houses in grey brick, identical in their dimensions, flush to the pavement, with narrow back entries running between the rear gardens of one row and the rear gardens of the next. Those entries were the arteries of daily life for the people who grew up there. Children cut through them between school and home. Neighbours passed through them carrying shopping. They were also perfectly sized for one person moving fast, invisible from the street. Academically, one study of Belfast's geography reached for a single word to describe the Ballymurphy layout: the maze of streets and cul-de-sacs. Maze wasn't a metaphor. The post-war housing design that built Ballymurphy also built its tactical character. Roads that curved inward without outlet, Junctions that looked like through routes from a distance but terminated in the backs of houses. Interconnecting pedestrian passages that linked one part of the estate to another without appearing on any military map in useful form. The height differential added another layer of complexity. Ballymurphy runs slightly uphill from south to north, so a firing position taken at the northern edge of the estate looked back down over rooflines toward the Springfield Road with a natural elevation advantage. To the east, across the 4 lanes of the Springfield Road, sat the vast Mackey's Engineering Works. James Mackey and Sons, one of Belfast's major industrial employers, a sprawling factory complex that had been a sectarian flashpoint for generations before the Troubles formalised the division. Belfast Aurora, a memoir of life in West Belfast between 1971 and 1974, places the Mackey's plant about a mile down the Springfield Road. On the other side of the main road was Ballymurphy. By 1970, the physical relationship was significant tactically. The open ground of the Mackey's perimeter to one side, the rising hillside behind the estate to the other. A soldier in the middle had exposure in 2 directions, and the maze of terraced housing between. The Springfield Road itself was one of the primary axes of West Belfast, running from the Lower Falls area northwest toward the hills. The Springfield Road RUC barracks sat along its length, a permanent target for IRA operations throughout the early conflict. Accounts from the period describe gun attacks on the barracks and its observation posts as near constant, with IRA units using the junction and the surrounding streets as both a firing line and an escape corridor. A soldier who arrived in Ballymurphy on rotation from Catterick or Aldershot stepped into a geography that had been contested for 2 years before they got there. For that soldier, working a foot patrol in 4 or 5-man formation, moving in standard spacing, watching corners, covering windows, tracking roof lines, the estate offered almost no orientation. The backs of houses looked identical. The end of one alley looked like the entrance to another. You couldn't see more than 40 or 50 yards in most directions before the housing cut your sight line. A soldier who had been in Ballymurphy for 6 months still didn't know it the way a 13-year-old who'd grown up there knew it by instinct. Not consciously, but in the feet, in the body, the kind of spatial memory that gets embedded in childhood and never leaves. The asymmetry between a local and a newcomer in that terrain wasn't modest, it was total. A man who had grown up in the estate knew which back entry connected to which street, which gable wall offered cover from which direction, which rooftop could be accessed from which garden, which cul-de-sac was a genuine dead end, and which only appeared to be. He knew where ambient noise covered movement, and where it didn't. He knew which residents kept dogs that would alarm when a stranger passed, and which wouldn't. He knew the whole thing the way you know your own house in the dark. That asymmetry was the foundation of everything Bryson did. The 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment, 1 Para, entered this terrain as part of Operation Banner, beginning in 1969, and was confirmed as the unit deployed to Ballymurphy during Operation Demetrius, the mass internment sweep launched on the 9th of August 1971. Over 600 British soldiers entered the Ballymurphy area in those opening days. Between 9th and 11th of August, soldiers from 1 Para shot and killed 10 civilians in the estate. A 2021 coroner's inquest, presided over by Justice Keegan, found all 10 had been entirely innocent, and that the use of lethal force had been without justification. That verdict, delivered 50 years after the fact, doesn't alter the institutional identity the Parachute Regiment carried into Ballymurphy in those first years. They were Britain's elite infantry, Airborne trained, aggressive by design, built around an institutional culture that valorized hardness and prized offensive action. Their self-image was inseparable from Arnhem, from the Falklands, from the role they had been designed to fill in conventional warfare. Between 1971 and 1996, 51 men of the Parachute Regiment would be killed in Northern Ireland. They weren't a symbolic presence. They were doing dangerous work in a genuinely dangerous place. The difficulty was doctrinal. Frank Kitson's Low-Intensity Operations, published in 1971, and the foundational British counterinsurgency text of the era, treated violence as an expression of organised, hierarchical, clandestine networks. Subversion worked through organisations. Organisations had command chains, resource flows, member lists. Intelligence could map them. Operations could disrupt them. Internment could decapitate them. The framework was coherent and had real operational validity. British pressure did degrade IRA capability repeatedly throughout the early 1970s. Kitson's framework was built around a specific kind of threat. An individual who happened to be inside an organisation, formally ranked, holding a command position, technically subject to IRA discipline, but who functioned with the operational autonomy of a man answerable only to his own judgment, was something the doctrine categorized without adequately modeling. You could sweep up the company structure around him. You could arrest his commanders. He'd fight out of every situation with sheer physical resolve. James Bryson was born into the Ballymurphy community around 1947 or 1948. By early 1970, when the Provisional IRA formally split from the official IRA and the Belfast Brigade began organising around its battalion and company structure, he was already positioned as a significant presence within the new organisation. A British Army War Diary entry, later uncovered and published by journalist Ed Maloney, recorded his rank and designation at the time of his arrest during the early internment period. Officer Commanding, B Company, 2nd Battalion, Provisional IRA. That is a primary document. It isn't a Republican commemoration or an oral history attribution. It's British Army intelligence confirming, in their own administrative record, that a man from Ballymurphy had built himself to the rank of company commander in the organisation they were trying to destroy. According to Maloney's research, drawing on sources including the Boston College Belfast project testimonies of the late Brendan Hughes, the Provisional IRA's initial organisational unit in Ballymurphy was formed in early 1970 when the local Republican community decided to align with the newly established breakaway group. The Provisionals had split from the officials in angry protest at the officials' failure to defend Catholic areas from loyalist and police attacks in 1969. They were, from their founding, committed to the armed campaign in a way the officials increasingly weren't. For the likes of James Bryson, this wasn't a difficult choice. Gerry Adams, the man who would become the most politically significant figure to emerge from this same community, later leader of Sinn Féin and the principal Republican architect of the peace process, was, according to Maloney's research, a central figure in the Belfast Brigade's West Belfast command structure in the early 1970s. Adams has always publicly denied IRA membership, a denial with legal force and real significance. What can be said with confidence is this. The Ballymurphy community that produced the IRA's most prominent political figure also produced, in the same moment and from the same streets, James Bryson. The politician and the gunman came from the same place, knew each other since childhood, and represented entirely different answers to the same question about what the armed campaign required. By the time one para arrived in Ballymurphy for Operation Demetrius in August 1971, Bryson was already an established operational presence. What happened in those first 3 years of the Troubles before his death has to be reconstructed partly from the oral tradition that survived him and partly from the documented record that confirms his reputation without always confirming specific engagements. The McGill magazine article on the Bryson incident described him as a feared sniper who used an Armalite rifle fitted with a telescopic sight. The Armalite, obtained by the IRA from sources in the United States in the early 1970s, was by 1972 the signature weapon of the Provisional Campaign in Belfast. Light enough for rapid movement and concealment, accurate at the street distances that Ballymurphy's terrain dictated, it was a rifle designed for exactly the use the IRA made of it. Short engagements, close to medium range, with the ability to break contact and move within seconds of firing. A soldier moving through a cul-de-sac in four-man formation, aware that a shot could come from any window or roof space in a 200-yard arc, had limited options for returning effective fire when the source of that fire was already moving. The Lewis gun is where the story gets stranger and more specific. Developed in 1914 and standard British Army issue through the Second World War, by 1972 it was a museum piece in almost every military context on the planet. The mural that Ballymurphy painted for Bryson after his death shows him carrying one. He had reportedly acquired it through whatever channels were available to an IRA company commander in West Belfast in the early months of the Troubles. Captured weapons, smuggled weapons, weapons that had been stored in Republican households for decades, handed down from the 1940s campaign or earlier. The Lenadoon confrontation of the 9th July 1972 is a documented historical event. The provisional IRA ceasefire collapsed over the movement of Republican families into contested housing in the Lenadoon area of West Belfast. A confrontation developed between the residents, British Army units, and IRA members. Bryson was there alongside Brendan Hughes and a fellow IRA volunteer. The ceasefire that the IRA's senior leadership had spent months negotiating, the ceasefire that had produced a secret meeting between Republican representatives and William Whitelaw, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, in London just 2 weeks earlier, ended in the streets of Lenadoon. That is what the mural painters in Ballymurphy chose to remember. Every Republican mural is a choice, not a neutral documentation, but an editorial decision about what a person means, what aspect of their life their community elects to carry forward. They could have depicted him with the Armalite, the more modern weapon, the one more associated with the sustained campaign. They chose the Lewis gun, the weapon associated with the moment the political calculation ran out and the direct response began. The escapes from British custody carry the same quality, direct, physical, and accomplished in the face of circumstances that would have stopped almost anyone else. He escaped from British custody at least twice in the period before his death. The New York Times covered his second confirmed escape on the 23rd February 1973, the day it happened. The newspaper described James Bryson, 24 years old, as an IRA leader who had led a 16-man escape from Crumlin Road Prison in Belfast. The headline read, "Belfast IRA leader escapes for the second time in 14 months." The mechanics of that escape have a quality of theatrical precision. Bryson and another prisoner, both facing arms charges, had smuggled a pistol into the facility. They used it to overpower prison warders in the underground passage connecting Crumlin Road Jail to the Crown Courthouse. They changed into the warders' uniforms. Bryson walked out of the courthouse, reached the street, and disappeared into West Belfast. His collaborator was caught before making it outside. Bryson didn't wait for him. 14 months, 2 confirmed escapes. The New York Times was covering the story on the day it happened because it was objectively significant news. A man the British Army had specifically targeted, arrested, and imprisoned had done it again. Not the same man twice. The same man at least twice, each time requiring the kind of physical composure and operational nerve that most people couldn't summon even once. The pattern is consistent across the documented incidents. No prolonged planning, no elaborate preparation, no waiting for the perfect moment. An opportunity presented itself. Bryson recognized it faster than the people around him and moved on it before that window closed. In the courthouse tunnel, the opportunity was a smuggled pistol and a pair of uniforms, and he walked out wearing one of them. The British Army wasn't dealing with a man who needed elaborate tactical support. They were dealing with someone whose decision-making cycle, under extreme pressure, operated faster than the institutional systems designed to contain him. For a British Army patrol working through the streets of the Ballymurphy estate in 1971, 1972, or 1973, Bryson represented a specific category of threat that trained infantry couldn't address through standard doctrine. Large-scale IRA operations, coordinated ambushes, bomb attacks across multiple targets, the kind of organizational activity that defined the later phases of the campaign, had a logic that trained infantry could engage. You could model them. You could predict likely attack corridors, establish vehicle checkpoints at choke points, use informer networks to anticipate planned attacks. Bloody Friday, 21st July 1972, when the IRA detonated 22 bombs across Belfast in under 90 minutes, was a terrifying demonstration of organizational capability. But it was organizational. You were facing a planned, coordinated effort by multiple participants with defined roles: driver, bomb carrier, timer setter, scout. Disrupt any one of those roles and the operation degrades. A single man with an Armalite in an estate where he knew every corner worked on an entirely different operational logic. Military psychology research on the effects of sustained sniper or lone gunman threat identifies 3 specific stressors that compound into disproportionate psychological load: isolation, ambiguity, and loss of control. A patrol under sustained threat from a single unlocated shooter doesn't know if it faces 1 man or 5. It can't establish the firing position with confidence because by the time the round has landed, the position is already empty. It can't predict the next contact through organizational pattern analysis. There's no cell meeting to identify, no driver to track, no bomb component to intercept. There is only one person's decisions, made in real time, on ground he controls, and his targets don't. A study of military psychology and stress responses notes that cortisol, the hormonal mechanism of sustained stress, is generated primarily not by danger itself, but by uncertainty and loss of control. The certainty of a large-scale attack, paradoxically, can be less physiologically and psychologically corrosive than the perpetual ambient possibility of contact from an unknown direction at an unknown time from an unknown number of sources. The known threat you can orient toward. The unknown threat you carry in your body every minute of every patrol. Bryson wasn't comprehensible within the British Army's threat model in the usual way. He had the rank, OC-B Company, 2nd Battalion, recorded in the war diary. He had the organisational context. He was formally exactly what the Kitson Doctrine was built to find and disrupt. But he also operated with a personal autonomy that meant suppressing the structure around him didn't suppress him. The 1971 internment sweep could take his commanders. He escaped. The 1972 ceasefire could put a pause on the armed campaign. He was at Lenadoon when it ended. British intelligence could build a file on him, map his movements, try to arrest him. He'd escaped before the New York Times ran his name on its front pages. The British believed, as the Maloney research confirms, that Bryson had killed a number of soldiers and policemen using his Armalite. The specific documented record doesn't yield named engagements with confirmed fatal casualties attributed to him individually. No official British Army casualty database cross-references his name to specific patrol contacts in the way an inquest record might. What exists instead is the weight of his reputation in both British Army and IRA accounts, which consistently describe him in terms reserved for operatives who have done what is claimed of them. A patrol soldier in Ballymurphy who had heard the name James Bryson, and by 1972 or 1973, any soldier who had done any reading of the intelligence briefings would have heard it, carried that name on every patrol. Not as an abstraction, as a specific local man of specific documented capability who was somewhere in this specific estate. The unit that killed Bryson compiled a detailed account of the operation about a single man's threat profile. British military intelligence does not generate detailed assessments of people who haven't earned that kind of attention. The Ballymurphy inquest that concluded in May 2021 provides one documented data point from the British side. A former captain in the Parachute Regiment, giving testimony about the August 1971 period, described an IRA ambush on a British Army convoy in West Belfast that showed the strength of the IRA in the area. A British officer, Parachute Regiment, under oath, using the word strength, not disruption, not nuisance, not harassment. Strength. The estate and its defenders had made that specific impression on the people whose professional judgment it was to assess military capability. 1972 was the bloodiest year of the entire conflict. Most British soldiers killed that year died from IRA fire. The preponderance of that fire came from snipers and gunmen working the back streets and rooftops of West Belfast's Republican estates. In Ballymurphy, the ambient risk wasn't a general statistical danger distributed evenly across the population. It was attached to specific people who knew which corner to take, which rooftop to use, where to exit. When a patrol started a 4-hour rotation through the estate, they were entering territory that those specific people had assessed and mapped in advance. The patrol was the variable. The terrain and the operator using it were the constants. The command structure that Bryson operated within was defined by 3 figures whose relationships illuminated the early IRA's fundamental tension between action and strategy. Jerry Adams, whose IRA membership he has always legally denied, and whose denial carries both historical weight and genuine legal force, was, according to Maloney's research, drawing on multiple historical accounts, a central figure in the Belfast Brigade's West Belfast command structure in the early 1970s. In his autobiography, Before the Dawn, Adams wrote that not long before Bryson's final summer, he had argued with him earnestly about the need to keep his head down, that things had changed from the time he could wander around the estate at will. The British were specifically focused on removing him. Adams understood the tactical and intelligence picture clearly enough to know that Bryson's continued visibility made him a target. Bryson understood this too. He went out anyway. Brendan Hughes, the Dark, commander of the West Belfast IRA's operational structure, who coordinated the movement of car bombs into Belfast on Bloody Friday and later gave testimony to Maloney for the Boston College Belfast project before his death in 2008, provided the sharpest available assessment of the dynamic between the political wing and the gunman. As Maloney published, Hughes described Bryson's view of Adams with characteristic directness. Bryson didn't trust Adams because he had never fired a shot. and Adams was, Hughes suggested, essentially frightened of him. When Adams needed to restrain or redirect Bryson, Hughes added, he would send someone else, a fellow operator, someone whose credentials Bryson actually respected. That characterization, applied by one of the IRA's most capable commanders to one of its most sophisticated political strategists, describing a relationship with a gunman from the same neighborhood, comes from Maloney's published account of the Boston College testimonies. Hughes wasn't a man given to diplomatic softening of personal assessments, and the specific operational detail he provides, that Adams had to route communications through a third party because of Bryson's personal mistrust, has the texture of something remembered concretely rather than constructed retrospectively. Adams moved toward political calculation. Hughes commanded operations. Bryson was at Lenadoon and made his own decisions about when the ceasefire was over. They shared a community, a cause, and a command structure. They didn't share a fundamental orientation toward the question of what the moment required. The summer of 1973 found the Belfast IRA under severe pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. In July, British forces arrested both Adams and Hughes at a brigade meeting in the Ive district of West Belfast, an operation that, according to subsequent analysis, appeared to have been enabled by an informer inside the organisation itself. In a single swoop, the two most significant figures in the West Belfast command structure were removed. Gerry Adams interned, Brendan Hughes interned. The organisation was exposed at its senior level, its meeting security comprehensively breached. Ivor Bell replaced Adams as Belfast commander. Bell's immediate project was structural. He understood, before most of the IRA's national leadership acknowledged it publicly, that the existing battalion and company framework had been so thoroughly penetrated by British intelligence that it could no longer sustain meaningful operations. The old structure, with its regular meetings, its known membership lists, its company-level administrative requirements, was hemorrhaging. Every meeting was a potential arrest. Every list was a potential source of names. Bell's solution was cellular. Small autonomous units, compartmentalized knowledge, direct command oversight rather than battalion-level bureaucracy. Bryson and Mulvenner were chosen as members of the new Ballymurphy cell. Bell wasn't using whatever warm bodies were available. He was designating the most capable and most trusted people he had for a critical unit in the reorganisation. The subsequent British Army assessment was direct. The Ballymurphy ASU was arguably the best provisional ASU in Belfast. That assessment came from the British Army's own internal documentation, written by officers who had spent months in the same streets trying to locate and neutralise exactly this unit. Within weeks of Bell's cellular planning being set in motion, both of its designated Ballymurphy members were dead. At approximately 6:35 in the evening on Friday, 31st of August, 1973, Bryson and Mulvenner were driving through the Bull Ring, the area at the centre of the Ballymurphy estate, a local name for the open space around which the housing grouped, the kind of place where people parked, walked to the shops, crossed paths with neighbours. Concealed British Army soldiers opened fire from a covert observation post hidden above the Ballymurphy shops overlooking the area. British Army documentation records the operation in detail. The tactic was the covert OP, a concealed position with prepared fields of fire established in advance and maintained with patience until the targets presented themselves. It was precisely the tactical methodology that Frank Kitson had developed through Kenya and Malaya and codified in low-intensity operations. Watch, wait, strike from a position the enemy doesn't know exists. By 1973, this approach had become a primary tool for intelligence-led contact. The soldier involved was interviewed years later by journalist Peter Taylor for a BBC television programme. In it, the soldier describes the operation from his position in the concealed OP, the wait before the targets appeared, the moment of engagement. He does not express remorse. He describes a military operation professionally executed against targets the British Army had specifically identified as among the most dangerous in Northern Ireland. Jim Bryson was mortally wounded, shot from a concealed position while in the car. Patrick Mulvenner, 19 years old, Gerry Adams's brother-in-law, was killed at the scene or very shortly after. The British Army's own assessment recorded that the ambush had destroyed, arguably, the best provisional ASU in Belfast and disposed of two of the most wanted and dangerous men in Northern Ireland. Bryson didn't die in the bullring. He survived long enough to be taken to the Royal Victoria Hospital. He died on 22nd of September 1973, 3 weeks and 3 days after the shooting. 25 years old. Some sources have used 31st of August as his death date by convention, applying the date of the incident rather than the clinical date of death. He was alive, in hospital, for another 3 weeks. The distinction matters because it means the British Army's covert OP didn't achieve immediate finality. It took the full weight of his injuries and 3 weeks for Ballymurphy to lose him. Soldiers photographed him in the morgue at the Royal Victoria Hospital, a photograph that would later appear on a Regimental Association website, where it remained on public display for years before being removed. A war trophy, a picture of a dead man, taken and displayed by the people who killed him. Whatever that says about the attitudes of those specific individuals, it also speaks to the weight Bryson's name carried in British military circles, enough weight that someone thought a photograph of his body was worth keeping and exhibiting as proof of what had been accomplished. Whether the bullring ambush was a chance contact or an intelligence-led operation targeting specific individuals is a question the available record can't definitively resolve. Bryson and Mulvenner were specifically designated members of a specific new cell. They were moving through a known location. The British had just arrested Adams and Hughes in what appeared to be an informer-enabled swoop. British soldiers were in position. The evidence is consistent with a planned operation. Whether it was planned is one of those questions the conflict left unanswered, and likely will leave unanswered. The immediate aftermath of the bullring showed how deeply Bryson's reputation was embedded in the Republican community, embedded deeply enough to generate a serious intelligence failure of its own. The provisional IRA in Ballymurphy and across West Belfast initially refused to accept that British soldiers were responsible for the deaths. They blamed the official IRA. The logic was this. Everyone knew the officials and provisionals were hostile to each other in Ballymurphy. The officials had political motivation to want Bryson removed. The ambush in the bullring looked, from outside, like something locally organised. The provisionals blamed the officials anyway. What followed was weeks of armed confrontation between the two Republican factions. Shooting incidents across Ballymurphy, assassination attempts, provo and official remand prisoners brawling in Crumlin Road jail. The British Army, which had just removed two of the most capable operators in the Ballymurphy unit, watched the resulting inter-Republican violence with practical interest. Frank Kitson had originally conceived of certain counterinsurgency methods, partly to exploit exactly this kind of friction between the official and provisional wings. The outcome here, whether deliberately engineered or simply an unintended consequence of the ambush's apparent ambiguity, was that the organisation that had just suffered a devastating operational loss also spent weeks fighting itself. Bell scaled his restructuring plan back substantially. The loss of Bryson and Mulvenner wasn't the only pressure. British security force successes across Belfast through August 1973 had degraded the available pool of capable operatives across multiple units simultaneously. But the destruction of the Ballymurphy cell was the most visible and symbolically significant loss. The people Bell had chosen for his best unit were gone. An honest accounting is owed before closing. The image of Bryson as a pure lone operator, one man, one rifle, the paratrooper patrols of Ballymurphy as his personal quarry, has a powerful hold on local memory and on the way his story tends to be told. That image contains essential truth about his character and his style of operation. His escapes were individual achievements. His presence at Lenadoon was his own decision. British Army intelligence tracked him as an individual threat and filed his intelligence assessment under his own name. Maloney himself, the journalist who initially published the Bryson story and who had access to British Army documentation, later issued a correction. The specific incident he had first framed around a lone operator was, the British documentation showed, carried out by a small cell. Bryson was one member of it, not the sole actor. At the time he was killed, Mulvenner was with him, in the same car. He operated within structures, early, loosely organised, prone to his own autonomous decisions, but structures nonetheless. Maloney's correction is itself the most revealing thing about Bryson's legend. The story was so coherent, so consistent with everything else known about this man's character, his escapes, his refusal to stand down when Adams told him to, that even a careful journalist with the documentation in hand initially accepted the lone gunman version without sufficient scrutiny. That is what a reputation of this specific quality does to the people trying to assess it. It makes the extreme version feel like the natural version, because the verified version is already extreme enough to make the leap seem small. What remains documentable is what the British Army's own record confirms. The IRA and British military both categorised Bryson among the most dangerous men in Northern Ireland. A former Parachute Regiment captain testified, under oath at the Ballymurphy inquest, to the IRA's operational strength in the area. 1972 was the bloodiest year of the conflict, with British military fatalities concentrated in the Republican estates of West Belfast. In Ballymurphy, danger wasn't an abstraction. It was attached to specific people on specific streets, and James Bryson was the specific person whose name appeared in both communities' reckoning. The mural went up in 2001 and 2002 at the junction of Ballymurphy Road and Spring Hill Drive, the first of 8 murals that the community painted in that period as Ballymurphy constructed its formal visual memory of the conflict. Kane, the conflict archive on the internet at Ulster University, documents the mural and its location. Bryson is depicted carrying the Lewis gun. The specific choice of that weapon over the Armalite that made him a feared sniper was a deliberate editorial decision by the people who commissioned the mural. They were saying something about which version of him mattered most to them. When Jerry Kelly, a Ballymurphy Republican who by 2001 was a junior minister in the power-sharing government, spoke at the mural's unveiling, he chose his words with the careful distance that the peace process era required. The two men had been leaders of the struggle who led with courage and imagination, and there was nothing to say they wouldn't have shown the same courage in the changed circumstances of 2001. Leaders of the struggle. The phrase simultaneously commemorates and maintains a safe distance from endorsement. The Republican movement in 2001 wasn't in a position to celebrate armed action, but it could mark people who had led with courage. It could paint them on a wall. It could choose them as the first in a series of 8. A fellow Republican, in a description preserved by the Relatives for Justice report, compiled for the Bryson and Mulvenner families in 2018, described the two men as ordinary young men in an extraordinary situation. Ordinary young men. Bryson had escaped British custody at least twice, been at Lenadoon when a negotiated ceasefire collapsed, and been named personally in British Army intelligence documentation compiled by the unit that eventually killed him. If that represents an ordinary young man, the situation was extraordinary, beyond any simple formulation. Nationally, he barely registers. He appears in Maloney's work as evidence in an argument about the IRA's structural evolution. He appears in the Kane database as a name, a date, a community, and a cause of death. The Relatives for Justice report preserves what the families know and what the records confirm. The broader political history of the Troubles, shaped inevitably by the peace process that ended it, organizes itself around the figures who navigated that transformation: the strategists, the negotiators, the people who moved the conflict from armed campaign to political settlement. Bryson sits entirely outside that trajectory. His career ended in 1973. He had no peace process. He had the bull ring at 6:35 on a Friday evening and 3 weeks in hospital before he died. The peace process history got written by the survivors. Bryson didn't survive to write his version of events, contest Maloney's corrections, or give his own account of what the early years in the estate actually required. He left the mural and the British Army intelligence documentation, and those are the two records through which he gets remembered. One painted by his community, one written by the people who hunted him. Put yourself, one final time, in the position of the officer writing up what the Ballymurphy operation had cost and what it had finally achieved. Summer of 1973. You're writing about one man. Your soldiers have just killed him from a concealed position in a roof space, using the same method of patient concealment and precise engagement that the man you killed had been using against your patrols for years. Your unit adopted the same tactical logic Bryson himself embodied. Know the terrain, find the position, wait, fire from concealment. The covert OP that killed him used the spatial intimacy he had used against your predecessors. To defeat him, the British Army had to become, in that specific operational respect, more like him. You note that the operation destroyed arguably the best provisional ASU in Belfast and disposed of two of the most wanted and dangerous men in Northern Ireland. You are a trained military intelligence officer filing a professional assessment. Those words aren't hagiography. They are your operational conclusion, written for an internal record, not for public consumption. Everything the British counterinsurgency framework was designed to handle: organised subversion, networked insurgency, identifiable command structures, Bryson represented in concentrated form. He had the rank. He had the organisational context. He was, formally, exactly what the Kitson Doctrine was built to find and disrupt. He was also something the doctrine didn't have a clean category for. A man who had decided, at some point in those early years when the provisionals were forming in the streets of Ballymurphy and the British Army was arriving in force, that he was going to refuse the logic of fear and overwhelming force. Not in a speech, not in a formal declaration. In a courthouse tunnel, wearing a stolen uniform, with a pistol he'd smuggled into prison past the people whose job it was to prevent exactly that. All the institutional weight of the British Army, the elite infantry, the intelligence networks, the doctrine of Frank Kitson, the operational planning of multiple battalion rotations cycling through West Belfast, had to replicate what he did naturally, and then wait for him to walk into the field of fire. That it finally worked does not make it simple. That it took until August 1973 to achieve it, after multiple escapes and a ceasefire collapsed and an intelligence file that kept expanding, says something precise about the specific quality of the problem he presented. He is largely forgotten outside the walls of Ballymurphy. The mural at the junction of Ballymurphy Road and Spring Hill Drive remembers him differently. So does the British Army Intelligence Assessment, written in the summer of 1973 by officers who dedicated that documentation to a single man, because one person from one housing estate in West Belfast had made himself worth that kind of attention. Subscribe for more stories like this.